So last semester, Eudora and I have had a teaching collaboration where it's not uncommon. She often comes to me to do some library sessions for her class. So she came in, and we originally planned to do 2 sessions. The first one, we would focus on meeting the students where they are and try to get them using Google, right? I mean, Google Scholar. We wanted to really meet them where they were, and we wanted to make them comfortable, right? We wanted to start with something that they felt like they could tackle. And then the second session we were going to dedicate to citing sources. So it ended up shaking out a little bit different. The first session we did focus on using some. Actually, we just focused on Google for that first session and looking at government resources, statistics, things like that, with the intent that it would be kind of working with the assignment that they had. They came in with questions.
I'll just jump in and tell you what the assignment is. And so based on teaching Comp 101 before, my experience with that, my experience was that when the library session seemed great, it seemed to go well, and then their sources raised from pretty good to just eye-rolling horrendous. For instance, somebody used a source in their paper that talked about the American dream, which dates from the 1960s. Whoa. So I was like sending these things off to Jessica saying, can you believe it, can you believe it? So I took a different tack for this Comp 101, and I gathered the scholarly sources, so it's not like we didn't take them off the table, but I gathered them. So I gathered 27 scholarly sources. 3 of them we used in class. The others I put on a grid. I had categories, rural, urban, and suburban, to take advantage. We have this great mix on campus of rural, urban, suburban kids, students. So those categories, and then the topics within those categories were housing, schools, and environment. So for the first paper, we modeled it with our mentor text. Then they had to analyze an article, but they picked that article from their grid of 24, picking 2 in each column, 2 rural, 2 suburban, 2 urban, and based on titles, picking 6, 2 from each column. For those 6, they had to write about why they picked those based on the titles. From the titles, then they picked 3 that they would do. No, all those 6, the 6 they picked, they wrote an analysis of the abstract. So that was a way to introduce them to the genre that's included in a scholarly article. And from the abstract, that selection, they picked 1 article to do an analysis paper. So their analysis paper, they were looking closely at how is a scholarly article put together, where is the thesis, how do they define terms, how do they do that, how do they signal whose ideas are whose. They turned in that paper the day that we came to the library, and that was the launch of paper 2, which was their research paper. We did a generating question session, so they came in with 5 questions. They had done the little seagull reading about research. We had talked about research. So when we arrived, they were ready.
And they came in with questions, and I had created an exercise where they would then use those questions that they came in with to think as a group. We divided them into groups, and they get to think critically together about what kind of information they would need to answer the question. So if I really wanted an answer to my research question, would I need personal statements? Would I need data? What would I actually need? And I think the opportunity for them to collaborate together to answer the questions was really beneficial. You could see them sort of contextualizing and creating knowledge together, and then we went around and shared. Every group had to share, and they did really well, actually. They did really well. So in the second session, we also we decided to stay away from citing sources. We didn't quite get to that. And that time we focused on using Google Scholar. Again, this was an opportunity to meet students where they are rather than trying to push them where we want them immediately. Not saying that we don't think that's important, but maybe it's easier to get them to build the skills if we could start a little bit in a simpler place. And actually, Google Scholar is pretty simple, right? So that actually worked really well. I mean, it's not a perfect tool, but it was a good place to get them started. Third session, we sort of did something totally different.
We did, and I think it came about because we were sort of debriefing about the second session, and I said, those tutorials, I wish they could just go in and do it when you're in the room. And Jessica said, we can do that. And so in fact,
The literacy tutorial?
thank you, the literacy tutorials.
Yes. And it worked really well. So a little bit of background, the information literacy tutorials are an online system that we offer to faculty. It fulfills some of the Gen Ed designators, so FS, FW, and FC. And faculty can opt to use it or not opt to use it. It's totally up to them. But it is something that a lot of faculty choose to use. That saying, the scores are never very good. So actually downright sometimes disastrous. I redid the tutorials 1 year ago this semester and did not notice a huge change in scores. Actually made the tutorials harder. I wanted to shift away, focus from just the point and click kind of narrative. I wanted to move more towards critical thinking, like what kind of resource I'm actually looking at. So they got harder. The scores stayed the same. Bad. So it was really neat. It was a neat opportunity to have students come in, and we paired them off. They worked together. We had to stress that they could keep the quiz and the tutorial open at the same time, even though those instructions are on both the tutorial and the quiz. But we had to kind of reinforce that. Eudora, you were saying this kind of comes back to...
Yeah, I think that they have this thing that it's cheating. And so they won't use the tutorial for the quiz. Like they'll look at the tutorial and then they'll look away and look at the quiz. And so to really get them to have them both open and to look and to work together, I mean, they figured out how to use a quiz as a study tool, not as like sort of a weapon against them. And I saw, even though it was on the screen, even though Jessica said use the tutorial, has you go through and told them exactly how to do it, I still heard oh, we can look at that, or why aren't you looking, hey, how come you guys aren't looking at the tutorial at the same time? So that peer understanding, I think, really worked well. And students were really engaged and really were looking for answers and relying on each other for information. So you could really see that they were building their knowledge together.
It was really neat also to see, I mean, it was really shocking for me because they understood so much more than I expected them to. And not Eudora's students in particular, but based on my experience with their scores, I was thinking that it was going to be really difficult. But they were getting it. They were just having a really difficult time reading the question correctly, which is maybe not always on them, right? But that close reading was really difficult, and they are hard questions, so they do need to read very carefully. But it was really interesting because we could see right where they were at. And it's just really positive. It's a really positive experience overall. The end result, I just ran an analysis of the scores, and the average score of the students outside of Eudora's class was about 60%. They scored about 60. And the average score in Eudora's class was an 86. So significantly better than what I've seen before. So.
And you could see that students, did it and then did it again and really worked at it. And I had 3 students came to my office and we did it as a group so that they could figure out what did they do wrong and really learn more from it. So that was really... I think that some of the things that worked out really well is that, if anybody teaches grammar or has an idea about that, what was really heartwarming was after we did this tutorial in the class, like a week or so later, I said, I want you to be familiar. Little Seagull has quizzes online. I want you to be familiar with them. Here's the link. Open it up. They immediately just got into groups. They got in and they started having heart-to-hearts about commas, and that was just awesome that they figured out we could use this tool. That it was fine to have your Little Seagull book open, it was fine to ask people, it was fine to sort of eavesdrop on the other group and say, what did you say about apostrophes? So that was, they transferred that. It wasn't simply stand alone, it happens in this room, but they really transferred that.
So Oxford comma, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello.
Is that even a question?
Yeah.
Can we find anybody in this room that would say no? Might be a skewed sample. Yeah. I think that's it for us.
Okay. Thanks so much. And thank you, Jessica, for saying that you are prone to nervousness. Because I am wildly prone to nervousness myself. And this is something I mentioned to my students on the very first day of class. And I think this is actually something that's quite helpful for my relationship with students. Being real in that way, I think, makes students want to learn from you much more. And also thank you, because I had not planned on saying anything about this. And I think that's another important thing for teaching students is don't be afraid to go off script. One of the best conversations I've ever had in one of my classes, we were talking about the philosophy of language. I was talking about a view called Millionism, where the meaning of a proper name is simply the object to which it refers, and somebody brought up, what about names from fiction, like Sherlock Holmes? This doesn't refer to any object, seems like a pretty clearly meaningful name, and I wrote my master's thesis on the philosophy of fiction and what it means to say something is true in a fictional discourse. We had a wonderful conversation. So being real in these ways, being willing to go off script, I think is really important. So thank you for stoking that in me. So on to the things I had planned on saying. So one of the things that I found wildly useful in teaching students, but teaching first-year students in particular, is always be willing to look at research on pedagogy. One of the things I will never understand is why people in institutions of higher education think that being an expert on X means that you're an expert on teaching X. These are two wildly different things. So I think we should be willing to look to the experts on such matters. And I think this is especially important for first-year students who have no experience with you in particular and have very little experience learning at the college level. So some of the empirical results I've found really helpful from some of the research on pedagogy is, for instance, that student integration, involvement, and engagement is absolutely central to their success. They need to care about that course to be successful. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Another thing that I think is really, really useful in terms of research on pedagogy is understanding concepts like stereotype threat. So stereotype threat occurs when somebody experiences fear of or feels at risk of confirming some negative stereotype associated with some social group to which they belong. And I guess I'll have more to say about stereotype threat later as well. But also one finding I've found extremely useful is that students do best when they schedule their studying. What the studying is turns out to not particularly matter. Simply that they schedule it, and that there's some self-testing component of that studying has been found to be really, really important for student success. So one of the things I try to do is I try to include some method for self-testing and trying to get a way to students to do that on a regular basis. So in my classes, my background is philosophy of language and logic. Defining terms in an overly precise fashion is something I spend a lot of time on. So I tell my students, one of the things you should do every time you walk away from my class, take 5 to 10 minutes, go through the definitions I gave that day, and try to tell yourself a story about this particular class. If you can give yourself a one-paragraph story from this class that uses the concepts I defined, you are going to be set for that particular class. So I try to give them a method of self-testing that can be done on a regular basis, so it's more likely to be scheduled. So looking at research on pedagogy, I think, is really important. But I don't mean that you shouldn't trust your own experience when I say that either. I just think that you should rigorously put that experience to the test. And I think you should do this in as many ways as possible. Put your own experience to the test in formal quantitative ways, in terms of very explicit evaluations. But I think you should infuse testing of your own experiences with different teaching methods in informal ways too. So one of the things I found really, really useful in my own teaching is throughout the semester I give multiple different evaluations throughout the course of the semester, because I think we should be responsive to evaluations, and there's only so much response I can give to an evaluation at the end of the semester after the course is over. I have found these evaluations throughout the middle of the semester wildly helpful in terms of the feedback I get. So one of the things I used to do when I first started teaching, whenever I felt that I'd been given a particularly unclear lecture or there was just a really dense lecture, I would start the next class with a recap. And students told me over and over again in these evaluations that these recaps are wildly helpful. So now I just do this to start each and every one of my classes, and students respond extremely well to this. But these mid-semester evaluations aren't just helpful in terms of the feedback I get. I find them really helpful for making students take ownership of their learning in that course. If they feel like they are going to have some impact on the course, they are much more willing to get involved, get engaged in that course. So on that note, in returning to one of the empirical findings that I mentioned at the outset about student engagement, I genuinely think that when it comes to teaching first-year students, getting them to care about the course material is quite a bit more important than how well you explain that course material. And I think part of this is just the classes we teach first-year students are often not super deep classes. If they care, if they're motivated, they can learn it. So spend some time getting them to care. Spend some time getting them motivated. Last night I was teaching a class on logicism. So this is a view by which mathematics is reducible to logic. It's one of the most boring things I teach to students. I absolutely love the thesis myself, but my students genuinely find it really boring. And I know this, so I tried to do something different this time. So I decided to introduce logicism by listening to Supertramp's The Logical Song and Living Colour's Cult of Personality. So in The Logical Song, Roger Hodgson has this line, 1, 2, 3, 5. And this is his way of trying to be as illogical as possible, getting something wrong with mathematics. So this is a way to introduce this idea that mathematics and logic go together. And the same thing comes in Living Colour's Cult of Personality. Corey Glover gives this line that authoritarians can get people to be so irrational that I can get you to believe 1 and 1 makes 3. Right, so again, this is just trying to get this idea that mathematics is somehow essentially connected to logic to students in a way that they might care about more. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to say is I think it's important to recognize that what your students are trying to get out of the class is not necessarily the same thing that you want them to get out of the class. By saying that, I don't mean to forget your goals. I just mean that you should remember that your students have goals, and likely they are different goals from yours as well. And generally, sort of generalizing on that idea, I think it's important to recognize that it's good to remember that your voice is not the only one in the classroom that matters, and that you should be trying to include as many of those voices as possible. And I think this is particularly important, for instance, with respect to this issue of stereotype threat. So Claude Steele, the psychologist who has spent the most time studying stereotype threat, for instance, points out that avoiding Eurocentrism and ignorance of other cultures other than your own is one of the best ways to reduce stereotype threat. I always have to say something at least somewhat controversial whenever I talk in front of people. So please stop, please stop just teaching rich white men in all of your classes. This is very off-putting to lots of people, and besides that, you are missing out on awesome thought if you are only teaching rich white men in your classes. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mel. I guess the reason why I'm sitting here is that I've taught freshmen quite a lot. When I was over at St. Lawrence, I taught in their first year program almost the entire time I was there. I've been teaching here in the freshman or in the FYS as well. And so I've been trying to think over the last few days what are some of the important lessons that I've learned from, trying out things, because as Mo said, we all don't get pedagogy. At least I got absolutely no pedagogy training in grad school whatsoever. I mean, we were not trained to teach at all. If you were not going into research, you were considered a failure. So why would you spend time on pedagogy? I've learned a lot through the years of doing this, with a lot of mistakes along the way. So I just wanted to underline a few of the lessons that I've kind of carried away from also comparing what is done over at St. Lawrence in the first year program versus what we're doing here. And I guess my first comment is really not connected to anything else. It's just something that came to mind immediately as soon as I started thinking about this. And this is, don't assume knowledge of technology in your students. They may be okay opening their app, they may be okay doing things on their phones and so on, but that does not mean that they have ever opened a PDF file. I've had more than a handful of times students telling me I had a really hard time reading the article because it was upside down and I had a hard time holding my laptop so I could read it. A task that to most of us, turning a PDF around is pretty obvious, but to students that can be a puzzle that they can literally not resolve on their own sitting in front of it. So making assumptions just because we are used to PDFs and Moodle and certain software that we use every day does not mean just because they use other technology that they know this. So don't get frustrated with them. Give them some guidance. It may seem silly to us to, now I spend the time to make sure that all my PDFs are not upside down when I post them. But I spend a moment and tell them, this is something you should know. So don't assume too much technology knowledge. The good thing about them is that they learn pretty quickly. Once you explain it to them, the learning curve goes by pretty fast. They can adapt to it pretty quickly because they have some prior knowledge from other areas that they're familiar with. I would say much more important is the next point I want to make, and I want to put this in a few different contexts. And this was especially interesting to me because now over the last couple of days I've used my opportunity of being in the classroom of asking my students, what was one thing a professor did for you in your freshman year that you thought was really, really helpful to you? Because, I'm a social scientist, why not ask the people that we are talking about? And one of the things that came up over and over and over again, and that when it would come up in the classroom, lots of students would sit there and nod their head, is create a personal connection to the student. I think that is much more important for freshmen than for upper division students. And I think there are a number of different ways in which you can create that personal connection. So one thing I think I've done pretty successfully in the past, or students at least react to this very positively, I give my students some way to get to know me outside of the classroom. I decide to share certain things about my life and me that have nothing to do with the class in itself. This may be a small problem, this may be something, but it just makes me human. They realize this is not a machine that is standing up front there and has all the knowledge and, can tell me what to do. I struggle, I make mistakes, so I share very intentionally stories like this to make me a person and not just, this creature that is standing in front of them. And in part, or one of the strategies that I've been able to use now over the last year and a half, and that has worked phenomenally well, I talk a ton about my dogs. This is nothing that is so personal to me that I would feel like my privacy is violated in any way, shape, or form, or that I'm giving too much away from me. Most people like animals. I like talking about my dogs. Students like being around dogs, so I always try to make it happen that while it's nice outside in the spring semester, I hold all my review sessions outside in order to bring my dogs to the review sessions. Again, so it gives them an opportunity to get to know a part of you as a person. And I think that is really important for freshmen. Students said over the last couple of days repeatedly to me, that made me go seek them out for help. Because they were more of a person, I felt like I can go to them and ask questions. And this gets me then to the second part that I also think is really important. Get them into your office somehow. Especially freshmen, there's a huge barrier to just ask, can I come talk to you? Can I ask you a question outside of the classroom? They're very, very reluctant to do that, in part, I'm sure, because maybe they have had teachers in the past in high school, where they were not maybe all that interested in doing so, or they now think, well, this is university, so this is a different story. These are professors now in front of me, these are not my high school teachers. But my experience is that when I get them into my office, so I intentionally create opportunities in my syllabus where, if the class is not too large, I may make it mandatory that they have to come and talk to me one-on-one. If it's a really huge class, I may say, I highly encourage you, and then I give them 5 good reasons, how it's going to benefit them if they come to my office to talk to me. And then once I have them in my office, of course, we talk about the questions that they have and the issue at hand, but I try to get an opportunity to also learn a little bit more about the student. So make that student more of a person to me as well, and not just, student 385 that I've seen over the last semester. I think that helps both sides to establish this more personal connection that the students seem to really be seeking out. In addition to that, so I do this with going outside and bringing my dogs, for example. I also intentionally walk on campus with my dogs, so then I encounter students. That again gives us the opportunity to have an interaction that's outside of the classroom. And repeatedly students told me, what I remember during our first year program, our professor decided that we're going to watch a movie together, and he ordered pizza, and we just sat somewhere and just, it's a 2-hour investment that you make. But it came back so many times over the last 2 days. Yeah, I remember that. That was great. They may not remember anything about the class they necessarily took, which may be a problem in itself, but that's on a different page. But those moments they remember, and I think that is very, very important. One other way in which I try to establish a more personal connection with my students is at the beginning of class, I basically hand them 2 note cards, and I tell them on one card they should put down their name, and then they should put down everything about themselves that they want me to know about them. What's your background? Where did you grow up? What kind of high school experience did you have? And I encourage them. I'm like, if you think, I'm in this class and I'm clearly lacking knowledge in this area that seems to be important in this class, I encourage them. Write that on there. If there's something that really concretely concerns you now that you've seen the syllabus and have thought about it for one, I don't do it the class of the very first class. I do it the second class after they kind of got an idea what the class is about. If there's something you really worry about, put that on there. Let me know, and I can take that into consideration when I go through the class later on. If there are 5 of them, they all say, I have a really hard time with this, and I know this is going to be relevant. I know to spend more time on it, and then the students feel heard. Then they're like, well, I told him, this is difficult for me, and now we're spending quite a bit of time on it to help. I found this is useful. I then allow them, or then I tell them the second card, they should not put their name on it, and they can put down anything that they would like to put down that they think would be useful for me to know. So I don't know. I just showed a movie in my international migration course that certainly has a lot of very difficult imagery and very difficult stories. Maybe a student is not comfortable putting on their card that they have been a victim of sexual assault. But maybe they want you to know that anonymously, that if something like this would be in a documentary, that you could give a trigger warning. If you concretely know that there's somebody that this may be difficult. So I find those 2 exercises or those 2 cards help me when I do those the second class of the semester to establish that personal relationship. I guess in general, one of the things I think we have to recognize is freshmen may take more of your time than your average students when they're more advanced. But the way I think about this is, and especially if it's then somebody who ends up being a major, I find this time well spent. because if I spend, an extra hour on a set of students early on in their studies, I probably have to spend a whole lot less time with them later on fixing things, because now they know from the get-go how to do this well if they take my advice. And again, if there's a personal connection, I think they're much more likely to take your advice that you give them. So, for example, students have told me it was really helpful that the teacher actually spent time with me. I went to him and said, I'm an athlete and I'm worried about the amount of stuff I have to do this semester, and I'm worried about your syllabus to get it all done. And, the teacher spent the 15 minutes going over the syllabus again with that student in detail, trying to figure out, when are your big sports meets, when do you have practice, and then scheduling time to study for that particular class. On Tuesdays from 2 to 4, you do have time to study for this course. So that extra time investment seems to be something that students really appreciate. And that, of course, goes along with time management and things like that. I learned the hard way, and that is basically check in on what prior knowledge they may have. So I'll give you an example. I teach international relations, and I always tell my students, when we talk about countries in the world, we kind of need to know where they are. And there's this statistic out there that every year they check how many of American high school students, high school graduates are capable of pointing out the United States on a world map, and over 20% of students are not able to do that. So in the past, I just started to get frustrated with, why don't they know this? This is such basic knowledge and so on, until it finally dawned on me, they're not being taught geography at all anymore in high school. I now always ask at the beginning of class, how many of you have had any kind of meaningful international geography in any of your high school classes? And out of a group of 30, at the most, 3 or 4 hands will go up. And I was like, oh, so it's not that they don't care, but this is just not knowledge that is provided anymore before they come to me. I didn't know that. I'm not in high school today, so I was not aware of that change, because when I went to school, and I'm sure many of you will have that similar experience, you had to learn world geography. So checking in every once in a while with what is actually there when they come to us, I think is really important. And beyond this general point, I think there are 2 components that are important here. So the one would be the time difference. We went to high school 20 years or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. They are going today. So there's a difference right here. But then, as you all know, there's a geographic difference as well. Not every high school prepares all students equally well. And we have to account for the students that may have not gotten an optimal high school education, and they're sitting now in the classroom with everybody else. So this is one of the things I try to encourage them to put on that sheet of paper. If you think there's knowledge that you lack, let me know, so I can make sure to understand that this is now my job to give this knowledge to you, if I think that this is important to have for the context in which we are working. And then the last point, again connected but slightly different, is be aware of the needs of your students, not just the prior knowledge, but the needs of your students. We have had a significant change in our student body here on campus, and that has also meant we have had a significant change in needs that students have. We've been part of a group of faculty members that have been thinking about the fact that, I don't know if that's your experience or not, but I have a lot more students show up in my office that are facing significant challenges, and not self-created challenges, but things like, I have a single mom at home. She got really sick now. She can't work anymore. I don't know I'm going to have money for being here next semester. I need to go home and take care of her. Things like that, of really significant issues that students are facing. Oftentimes, related to maybe coming from a background that is not as affluent, coming from difficult context in more general sense. So look at that. Look at your student holistically. Realize that they may not just be lazy, or they may not just have a hard time concentrating. There may be a significant reason for that. And if you have established that personal connection with your student, And I guess there's a positive and a negative side to this, but that makes it much more likely that your students will come to you and tell you about those things. Instead of sticking their head in the sand and saying, well, I guess I'm going to fail this course because I can't meet the deadline. There's nothing I can do. They may feel more comfortable in saying, I have actually a significant issue. Is there any way that you can help me? And my experience is that those students are never demanding. They're never coming and saying, you have to help me because I have a hard time. They're usually very, very humble and are really coming to you as a last-ditch effort to somehow turn this around for them, maybe because they've had a particularly challenging semester. So keep the background of your students in mind. Keep in mind that their growing up may be very, very different from the growing up that you have experienced. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I'm going to do some dittos, but I have some. I'm going to focus a little bit on first day. Again, I'm Walt Conley. I've been teaching first-year students for over 30 years. And one of the things that I heard a lot from faculty members when I started was that how much better students used to be when they started teaching. And I promised myself I would never become that guy. And I have to be happy to say I'm not. But I have seen some ups and downs. I've found every class unique. But I do want to make learning outcomes clear. So very first, Michael and I were talking about the importance of the syllabus. I also want to make my expectations clear, but not to the point where they're frightening. So you want to make them a little comfortable, especially first day. I do learn their names, and even though my class sizes are usually, they've ranged in the teens to the 200s, and they're usually somewhere between 50 to 150 is my average class size. So that takes a little effort, but I do that partly by having cards. But I ask them not just their name and address, but also get their seat, so I can do a seating chart. And then I do what's your favorite music, what's your favorite author, book, movies, things like that. And that gives me an opportunity to talk to them. So, oh yeah, I like that book too. Did you like that book? So you can create conversations from that knowledge. I also ask them what their hobbies are, what they like to do for fun, something interesting about them. And the most interesting one I remember was when a student told me she was a mermaid. And I thought, ooh, this is kind of strange. Turns out on weekends she worked, this was in Florida, she worked at Weeki Wachee Springs where she acted as a mermaid all weekend. So it was actually quite literally, I did have a mermaid in my class. So I had that. I also start every class with music actually, and I actually relate it to the topic of the day. So that becomes something they have to think about, like what was in that song that is going to be playing today. Modest Mouse is awesome because they have so much science in their music, so I use that a lot. And this goes back to tape decks. I used to do that, so I've been doing this a long time. And I do tell stories. So like making that connection, I do tell stories. One time I was teaching down at the Gulf Coast Research Lab, and my students are doing something with their phone, and I said, what are you doing? They said, they were taping my stories and playing them back in the dorm at night. So anyway, so a little bit about first-year students. One of the things I try to make clear to them is that college is different. So this is not like high school. It's not a grade jump. It's not going from 12th to 13th grade. It can be an order of magnitude jump in expectations, especially about what they learn and the rigor that they'll have to apply to their course. I tell them that some of these students, as you probably know, they've done really well in high school. They come to college and boom, all of a sudden they get their first low grades. They can't study a day or even just a few days before an exam. And remember, I'm teaching sciences. Not that all topics are like this, but it's there's a little rigor there. So it does take some time. I told them they need to study every day, and even if they don't have an assignment, they should be reading and doing some work from the syllabus. We don't necessarily tell them to read chapter 3 today, but it's on their syllabus that they should have been reading that, so I remind them of that. I do tell them find a place to study, but not in their dorm, and not in their apartment. So there's too many distractions there. Of course, I always talk about the library, but that's not the only place. This campus is wide open. There are classrooms everywhere. So I tell them to find a place to go, even if you change. Like I used to go up and go to different places, throughout the night to find a place to study where I could focus. Learning is hard work. I don't want them to think it's easy. It takes most of your brain is engaged during learning. You should be tired when you've studied, and that's The brain and muscle use most of our body's energy. I'm throwing a lot of biology in this because that's where I go. So they use about 100 pounds of ATP a day, just processing, breaking, making bonds, all that energy that's going on in there. It's hard work. A large brain is biologically expensive. It's one of those use it or lose it. We know that actually professors have the lowest rate of adult onset dementia because of the way we use our brain. So we're always using it. And I'll tell you one more story in a minute. The more you work your brain, the better it functions. Now, one time I made this thing talking about how brains and muscles work in the same way, where you really have to use them to make them work, and the more you use them. And a student came to me and told me she was at some party or something, and she said, Dr. Conley, you told us that the brain is a muscle. And they told me not. I said, I did not say that. The brain is not a muscle. Okay, it's not a muscle. Okay. So active brains are highly engaged. That 10% thing, that's total fiction, regardless of what's in the movies. When we're using our brain, we're using the whole thing, and you can see that, that get rid of that urban myth. So I do get some biology in there because it's a biology class, but I talked a little bit about the biology of learning. When you study, you enhance the physiological changes in your brain. We don't make more cells, but what we do is we make those cells work better. So there are more synapses that are created. The chemistry between the synapses work better. So you're actually making your brains, you're making yourself smarter. And I make the connection between first year and senior year. When you go back to your senior year and you think how easy your freshman year was, even though it seems really hard now, it's because you have learned how to learn. And that's an important thing that I try to emphasize in the first couple of weeks. So strengthening connections among cells. And then I go through this thing this is based on research about how students learn or how people learn. And some of these are 6 major actions. It's in a couple of biology textbooks, but I just kind of go through this with them and kind of make it relate to them. But you do have to concentrate. So when you study and when you learn, you have to focus on that material. It increases brain activity, increases epinephrine, which we know increases our ability to learn, and it enhances the long-term memory that occurs with study. You need to minimize distractions, so don't try to study with your TV on. Don't try to study with a lot of music in the background. Take your cell phone, shut them off, put them away, go away, off, somewhere, don't bring it with you, okay? I think that's probably one of the most common distractions our students have now. I don't know if you've experienced that. There's some addiction students have. I remember taking a cell phone away temporarily from a student. He started shaking, and it was like, so we do see that. I just read an article about that this weekend. It takes a lot of time to learn. It's not something that happens quickly. 2 weeks, I tell them to start studying intensely for an exam, like 2 weeks before the exam. That's when I start giving them their learning outcomes and start working on essay questions, things like that. You have to spread it out. Don't start in the same place every time. Don't try to cram. It never works. Even though you'll see students studying right up to the minute before you pass out the exams, right? So I think they're going to get something there. Study things in small pieces and then put it together. If this type of information can be overwhelming to a student, so if you take it in little chunks, separate it out, put it back together. I tell them some of the ways that I've done that. Take breaks. It helps to do that. And this is an important one I learned from a former professor, because I have had courses in pedagogy and learning. There's something that happens when we write things down and make notes. So I emphasize that you don't take notes, don't be a stenographer, but you have to make your notes. So you listen, put it in your own words, and write it down however way you do, right? And then leave space for you to make other notes later, because that should be your core. But it's really a translation that occurs during the lecture or during the activity or however you do your class, so that they're not just copying down every word you write, or trying to copy down everything in the PowerPoint. So when you make your notes, you listen, translate, you leave room for other comments. You may not get every word, and that's okay. In biology, it's very visually learning, so I use only images that are in the textbook, or almost all that. I reference the page number, I reference the figure number so that they can go back to it. I tell them they can record audio anything they want, just set up close if they want to do that. Most students don't do that, but they're welcome to. That's not good, right? I mean, have you had students starting to do that with their cell phones? No, go put it away. You're not going to do that. That's not how you take notes. I don't care if that just you might as well go to the book, right, and do it that way. Self-testing is really important. This is something I learned to do this, actually in physics, when we were allowed to take in a crib sheet. I started making them for every class, just so it would focus my learning, and I tell my students how you do that. So you make outlines, diagrams, flashcards, and then test yourself. And I learned this one from a colleague, where you just take a bunch of flashcards that, things you have to learn, and you make 3 piles. Like, one pile is the one you don't know these at all. These you know really well. These you kind of know just a little bit. Okay, so you keep working those cards until you get them all into that pile that you know really well. You're not always going to start at the same place, but it helps you to process that type of information and what you learn.
I'm going to give a hand to our panel.
Yeah, you should stop there. Other students down